sure you recognize the gentleman sitting to my right, but I wouldn't be surprised if some of you don't, because I didn't the first time I ran into him the other day at Surrey Fort coffee shop, because you've removed that very characteristic moustache, and then suddenly I said, I've seen this gentleman somewhere, and said, there he is, Kamal Hassan. What was the mission?
The mission, if you're trying to sort of give me a clue as to
Sashi,
what I should say,
a veteran broadcaster and one of the most well-known and respected anchors on Doordarshan. Sashi read the news and cinema was his forte. In fact, Doordarshan's coverage of national and international film festivals was somehow just not complete without Sashi. Sashi, reminiscing about his early years with Doordarshan.
My association with Doordarshan dates back to the 1970s, the late 1970s, when Doordarshan started in Chennai, and I was among perhaps the first batch of news presenters on Doordarshan in English. In those days, of course, there was no national network. We had only the regional kendras. And in the English news on Doordarshan out of Madras in those days, I and some of my colleagues used to read the news. So my getting into the television media was perhaps for the wrong reasons to start with, because I was always fascinated with cinema and wanted to be involved with cinema, and that was easier said than done. And I thought it was a good way to try and understand the visual medium through television. And so when television came up and I got the opportunity, I was auditioned and chosen to present the news. I thought that could be a launching pad, as it were, into the world of celluloid. But having got there, I found the medium fascinating. It was a new medium in those days. By current standards or contemporary standards, it might look very obsolete, because we were using Sepmac tapes, we were using huge cameras. It was all on analog production mode, not digital as it is today. The production meant a huge team moving out, very ponderously, much like in a film style. And editing was on reverse film or 16mm negative in rare cases. And so we went through the whole technological learning curve. Today, of course, as we know, it's all digitized and fast and instant and very user-friendly. Those were days of hierarchies in the film world and in Doordarshan, and I remember I was craving to produce a program on Doordarshan, although I was reading news and enjoying myself. And the opportunity came because the director of the Kendra then, I think it was Mr. Muralidharan then, who offered me the opportunity to produce a comprehensive documentary on the celebrations of Onam in Kerala, because that happened to be my home state, although I've never studied there and so on. And in that process, I was able to actually produce my first program for Doordarshan. And I still remember that I was mentioning the hierarchy. In order to look through the camera eyepiece, the camera that's looking at me in those days, it wasn't easy unless you were initiated and unless the camera person thought you fitted the mantle. You were not allowed to look through the eyepiece of the camera. And so that was a great honor and a great breakthrough for me. I had, in fact, I thought I had arrived when I looked through the eyepiece and framed my first shot for this documentary. It was also a wonderful team that we had in Doordarshan in those days. I remember my colleagues in Doordarshan, many of whom I continue to be in touch with, some of whom I continue to work with. Sampath Kumar, Veera Raghavan, Nishat Ahmed, and many, many others on the technical side, on the creative side, the news side, and very, very serious and, shall we say, committed editors in the news department who were also scholarly in their own way. I find very few of the same kind of people these days, not just in Doordarshan but across the board. So it was a fascinating early phase that I belonged to in the Chennai.
From the then Madras Kendra, Sashi moved to national television.
And when national networking started, and I remember I had to go to Delhi, and if I remember right, I read the first national news bulletin along with Neeti Ravindran, which linked all the other kendras. And that was, of course, a huge quantum leap as far as I was concerned, being pitchforked from Chennai to Delhi and into initially hostile environs, but very quickly adapting myself and very quickly understanding that everybody there is as friendly as they were here in Chennai. They, I think, took me under their wings, as it were, the important people in Delhi and those who were already, had gone way down the line in terms of producers, editors, the deputy directors general, and so on and so forth. So Mandi House and Parliament Street, initially Parliament Street and later Mandi House, when Mandi House was built, became reference points for me in terms of my career in Doordarshan. I continued to read news for many years. I forget how many, and there were excellent colleagues who I read news with. Apart from Neeti, there was Tejeshwar Singh, who was no more, unfortunately, but I remember his stentorian voice. Ramu Damodaran in those days, who we remembered for his phenomenal memory. He could memorize pages by heart. He could memorize pages after pages and deliver them. And these were, remember, days without the auto cue, without the teleprompter. So you had to read off a written text, which was compiled and placed in front of you on the desk as you went live on the news. And Ramu was distinctive in that his memory power was phenomenal. Of course, Gitanjali Iyer and Komal G.B. Singh and many others whose names instantly don't come to mind. So apart from, of course, again, the invisible producers, the editors, the entire team that made it all possible. So I think Doordarshan as the first and the enduring stable from which all expertise in television in India was fostered, was nurtured, and from which emerged the stalwarts of the independent television scenario that we see today. These were the beginning, these were the formative years, and it all began by reading news, and then I went on to do productions, and so I was a kind of officially a news presenter, but I think I enjoyed the producing part, the direction part, the scripting part as much, or perhaps more than reading news, which after a point perhaps tends to become mechanistic.
Shashi not only loved cinema, but in fact commented on it with elan and authority. During international film festivals, he interviewed luminaries of the celluloid world, much to the delight of avid cinema lovers across the country.
I was thinking about the programs, the major programs that I did for Doordarshan in those days on camera, apart from presenting the news. The one big series that I did, which comes to my mind, is covering the international film festivals. I was then the official correspondent, if you like, of Doordarshan in terms of coverage of film festivals, international film festivals which were held in India. Those days they were mostly held in Delhi, and initially it was all in Delhi, and then there was a process of alternating between Delhi and one other film center. For instance, it would be in Delhi, next year Bombay, again Delhi, then Chennai, then again Delhi, then Calcutta, and so on. And I've even lost count, but I think I covered several of these international film festivals for Doordarshan. Coverage would mean rushing through, seeing all these films, and which is itself, it's as fascinating as it's heady and as frenetic. It's a very fast-tracked kind of activity. So you have to watch the films, summarize them, paraphrase them, review them for the viewers, also recreate, evoke the atmospherics of the festival for the viewers, interview important personalities, filmmakers, creative artists who have come for the festival. So it was one of the most challenging things that I've ever done. Even looking back today, I don't know whether I'll be able to do it with the same kind of energy and vibrancy that I brought to it in those days.
Shashi Kumar was an excellent interviewer and his programs made for gripping viewing.
I would do interviews with important personalities, and one of my very early interviews which got me into trouble and might really have ended my career on Doordarshan prematurely was that with Swami Chinmayananda. Because I approached the interview as a skeptic, as an agnostic, and questioned the premises of his philosophy. And he's, of course, a great orator, great thinker. And I remember this was done in the Doordarshan studio in Chennai. And even before the interview was completed, he was impatient. He banged the chair, got up and left the studio. But I think all of this went on air, and there was an instant reaction to it. I remember there were very hostile reactions from followers of Swamiji who thought I was being irreverent to him. Because remember, these were early days of television and Doordarshan, where the critical interview, in the real sense of the term critical, was hardly even the exception, right? Forget about the rule. You tended to do it more or less in terms of not treading on anyone's corns, including the interviewee. I remember there were telegrams, there were telephone calls from Mandi House. Mandi House was his dreaded existence in Delhi as far as Chennai was concerned. And if there was a telephone call from Mandi House, it was either to pat you on your back or to censure you, and either way it made a huge difference. But in this case it was brickbats, I'm afraid. And what saved me and perhaps the day as far as Doordarshan was concerned was, even as there were a number of calls and telegrams which took me to task for my on-camera irreverence, there were also a number of calls and telegrams and responses, including by some chayas or followers, as the Swamiji was called, who thought that this was for once a very critical and bold and logical way of looking at the role of religion in society, the role of those who preach about religion in society, and so on. So I think it cut both ways at the end of the day, and that saved my job and the day. Of course, I've interviewed several other VIPs, politicians, cultural activists, social activists, and business leaders, and so on. Another interesting interview I remember, not so much for the interview but for what happened afterwards, was that with JRD Tata. This was in Chennai, and he came again to the Doordarshan studios on Adams Road in Chennai, and I interviewed him on his multifaceted personality and his work, his wonderful work, also as a business leader. And at the end of the interview, we go down, and there is a process whereby there's a check given to interviewees at the duty room of Doordarshan, right? And Mr. Ratan Tata, not Ratan Tata, JRD Tata, his father, came down, and we went to the duty room, and the duty officer, I remember, it was a wonderful colleague of mine who was PEX then, and then went on to become, I think, assistant director, and I don't know where he is, he must be in All India Radio now, Subramaniam, who told him there is a check for you, sir. And VIPs those days probably got a higher amount, probably 500 rupees or 600 rupees, which is a big amount in those days. And Mr. Tata said, of course, I didn't know I'm going to be paid as well. And we said, yes, you get a payment for this. And then Mr. Tata said, oh, but can I endorse this check to something, because I don't need to be paid for this. And I think he endorsed it to the Doordarshan Sports Club or the canteen on behind the check. And all was fine, and we were shaking our goodbyes when Mr. Subramaniam, the duty officer, said, sir, but you have to pay me 20 paise revenue stamp for the check. And Mr. Tata searched his pockets and said, but I'm sorry, young man, I don't have any money with me. This is Tata, remember. And so Subramaniam, of course, was a very conscientious duty officer. He said, but the revenue stamp. So I told Subramaniam, I'll pay for the revenue stamp, forget about it. So Subramaniam said, okay, that's fine. And then when I was seeing Mr. Tata off in the car, he shook my hands and said, remember, I owe you 20 paise. Now, that's itself a fascinating story to be, I could tell people that Tata owes me money, it's quite a fascinating idea. But what was even more fascinating is several years later when I had shifted to Delhi and I was on national television and so on, I run into Mr. Tata again and I'm interviewing him again, this time in his capacity as chairman of the Family Planning Foundation of India, if I remember right, yes, chairman of the Family Planning Foundation of India. And again, the interview is done, I think, in the Parliament Street, Doordarshan, Akashvani Bhavan. And after the interview, Mr. Tata actually remembers me, and he says, "I remember I owe you some money." I said, I didn't even think you'll remember. He said, no, I remember the people I borrow money from. So we laughed it off, and then he said, let me see if I have some money now. And he said, but again, I don't have any money. I'm sorry, I can't pay you back your 20 paise, even with interest. So then I told him, no, Mr. Tata, I'm glad you don't have any money, because if you paid me back the money, I can't tell anybody else that Mr. Tata owes me some money. And he laughed. And so that was another memory. I mean, one of those anecdotes which comes to mind.
Shashi, in the role of a documentary filmmaker, gave Doordarshan some of its most memorable films.
I've also done a number of documentaries on various aspects of life and society. I remember two particular longer features that I did. One was called Nemesis 2. It was a science fictional film about a future which has been ravaged because of our insensitivity to ecological concerns, and how the environment or ecology takes revenge on civilization. These were early days, and we shot this on Set Mac in black and white, and it was a 45-minute long feature. It was science fictional, and I remember we had to go out into the streets and shoot early morning and late night because it was meant to be a place where all the people had deserted the roads, and very few people were alive because people were dying because of deoxygenation. I even forget the exact nature of the script, but I know that this was one of the themes. And fish were dying in fish tanks and ponds and so on and so forth. And the protagonist of the film was my colleague, news producer, who I still work with in this Asian College of Journalism, Nishat Ahmed. He was a very dynamic producer then. He continues to be a dynamic producer and teacher now. And he was the actor. He was the principal lead actor, protagonist of this film called Nemesis 2. The other very significant and chastening for me experience as a filmmaker was my first, I think, mega documentary. It was an hour long, shot on 16mm negative color, so which needed a special sanction from Mandi House. They needed a special budget, and it was shot not just in Chennai but over several parts of Tamil Nadu and Kerala, because this was a real life story of a young woman with cancer. It was a friend of mine, and both she and her husband, T. Jayaraman's wife, Vijay Lakshmi is her name. The title of the film was Vijay Lakshmi, the story of a young woman with cancer. She had abdominal and metastasized cancer. She was a theoretical physicist, and a very good one at that, at the cutting edge of her work. And she had done a PhD and she was doing a postdoctoral work, but she knew that, and medical science and doctors had told her that she had only some months to live. And she was very happy to be involved in making this film about her own life. She acted it. I mean, she was we didn't produce another actor. She herself played her role, and that was a fascinating and a painful and a chastening, as I said, experience for me. After I moved on to Delhi, I did a number of programs for Doordarshan, both within Doordarshan and outside. From Doordarshan itself, as I said, the film festivals. I did a number of programs called, I think, Jan Adalat or something, where we had ministers and the people interacting with one another. Nalini Singh and I were the co-anchors of that film, of that series. It was a series during the Janata rule, I think, in those days, in power. Then I took a break from television because I moved out as the West Asia correspondent of the Hindu. And I was based in Bahrain for 3 years, between 82 and 83 and 86. And when I came back, what I saw was a totally different Doordarshan. It was a Doordarshan of perestroika and glasnost. The censorship that was implicit in our minds had all disappeared, had evaporated. Doordarshan was being very critical, very self-reflexive, bold programs were being made. There was a lot of excitement and frisson, in the air. And I think perhaps the golden period of Doordarshan, perhaps in the mid-80s.
When the Soviet Union was disintegrating, as head of PTI television, Shashi Kumar produced some of the most outstanding current affairs programs for Doordarshan. Shashi travelled to the hotspots to report. Shashi Kumar also produced a series of popular programs, Money Matters and Tana Bana.
So when I came back from my stint in Bahrain, it was an exciting new Doordarshan that one saw. And at that time I was asked to set up the television wing of the Press Trust of India, PTI. And we set that up as PTI TV, as it was called. And for some time, from 1986 well until the early 90s, as part of PTI TV, we produced, I think, some of the most significant programs for Doordarshan under the PTI TV banner. Particularly programs relating to foreign coverage, policy issues, which were done for Doordarshan. I remember particularly our 3-part documentary on the collapse of the Soviet Union, what's called Glasnost and Perestroika in the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Ceausescu regime in Romania and the coal miners' strike. I was there immediately after Ceausescu fell, and those were very, very heady times in Romania, and we shot over several days. Getting there was a problem in those days, and that was shown on Doordarshan. We did a feature called Disarmament and Development, for which I went over some 7 or 8 countries and did a feature on disarmament and development, because disarmament and development was a plank of the Indian foreign policy in those days, and this was seen as a very significant documentation by India. I did a program, several part program on the IPKF engagement with Sri Lanka and the whole Sri Lankan crisis as it evolved and as it played out, on Afghanistan, on Iraq. So we were, I think, the chosen or the preferred production house for programs relating to foreign policy and issues of foreign affairs by Doordarshan. And I think we acquitted ourselves rather well, because many of these programs went on to receive very good critical reviews in the media, and also by peer review in terms of peer recognition. So those were very satisfying days for me. And so well until 91 and 92, I was with PTI TV, primarily producing programs for Doordarshan, me and my team again in PTI. It's a small, out of the basement just across Parliament Street, where Doordarshan's offices were. And until I left to start my own channel, Asianet, which is the channel in Malayalam for the Malayalam-speaking people in India and other parts of the Gulf. So that, I think, brought the curtains down, as it were, on my official and very hectic and very rewarding engagement with Doordarshan. And I have very, very fond memories of these years. And as I always say, all of us came from that stable called Doordarshan, now called Prasar Bharati. And what we learned there, and what we did thereafter, we owe really to the formative years spent there. And therefore there's no question that we owe tremendously to Doordarshan and to all those who made this possible for all of us.